Farmers have a lot on their minds these days. Volatile commodity markets, profitability, passing on the farm to the next generation. And of course, we hear a lot about the environment. Farmers are regularly being reminded that water quality and seemingly the overall health of our ecosystem depend on them. The film you're about to see deals with one of these issues, specifically the advantages to you and your farm of keeping livestock out of streams and rivers. You will not hear accusations about how the farmer is to blame for water quality downstream. No, this film is about you. It's about how your farming operation can be more efficient, more profitable, and ultimately more successful by implementing one single practice. Sure, it's good for water quality. It's good for streams and rivers. And rest assured, it is good for the bay and the environment. But it's ultimately good for your farm and especially your animals. That's according to Corey Gilliams, District Conservationist with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, and John Welsh, Agent with Virginia Cooperative Extension.
When livestock are excluded from a stream, it is a good thing because the cattle are no longer exposed to certain bacteria that are transmitted and other viruses and pathogens that are transmitted through the water. A good majority of the diseases that affect cattle can be transmitted through the water, and by having them out of it, they're taken away from that. Another good way to look at it is the majority of the things that farmers vaccinate for can be picked up through what they call the fecal oral pathway, which is drinking water that other animals could have defecated in. So by removing them from that environment, there's less chance of risk of being exposed to that. So another thing to look at is by excluding livestock from streams and giving them a good clean water supply, alternative water supply we call it, they can experience better weight gains, they can have less problems with pregnancies.
Well, I think there's multiple benefits to stream exclusion. Obviously as an agricultural producer myself, you look inwards a little bit to see how does it benefit me. And there are agricultural benefits to producers. There's some pretty notable effects on livestock performance. And then there's kind of the value in selling yourself in agriculture to your neighbors and your community better, I think is another impact that you have to look at.
Dr. Scott Nordstrom is a large animal veterinarian with years of experience. He has worked with dairy, beef cattle, and equine operations. Nordstrom is just one of a growing group of veterinarians and others who are talking about why it makes sense to farmers to improve herd health by restricting animal access to waterways.
Feet and legs are really important to dairymen on a farm like this because these cows have to walk to food and water. They have to walk to be milked twice a day, and farmers spend a lot of time making sure that they have healthy feet and legs. And one of the things that happens is if we allow cows to stand in water, it starts to damage those hooves, and we can get bacteria that can penetrate, and it can really be a great source for hoof rot. So it's really imperative that we keep them out of those waterways because it's going to cost us money. They're not going to be able to eat as much feed, and they're going to have problems getting to and from their water sources. So that's going to be really critical for us.
We'll spend more time talking about specific issues with herd health, but first let's take a look at some of the fundamental reasons for excluding livestock from streams.
With respect to animal health, there's some really good research out there. Probably Canada has some of the best research on that, and really good data that shows that access to clean drinking water, which is obviously the most limiting nutrient in all of our animal rations, has pretty profound effects on performance.
Dr. Nordstrom talks about high-producing dairy cows and why they should not be allowed to stand in water.
This specific cow here is actually making 150 pounds of milk a day. So you can imagine it's really important for her to get a lot of good quality water and to be able to get that water from a clean, safe source. And one of the things we don't want to see is cows like this out in pastures standing in either running or standing water.
There are a lot of benefits of having access to clean water. They include increased milk and butterfat production and also increased weight gain. Dairy producers report increases in milk quality and production after restricting stream access and providing alternative water sources. Beef cattlemen have also reported increased weight gains after providing alternative water sources.
I've heard a number of farmers that we've participated projects with on our farm in the past say that they noticed their cattle were putting on weight a little better, kind of anecdotal, no actual measured results. I know some research has been done here in Virginia by DCR and Virginia Tech that showed that particularly in stocker cattle, steers gained at least a pound a day or more drinking fresh water and being fenced out of the stream than the same size cattle that had access to a stream. And heifers gained anywhere from a half a pound to a pound and a half more a day by being excluded from the stream and having a fresh water supply.
Nordstrom talks about several reasons dairy farmers should be concerned about water quality and cow productivity.
Well, huge. First of all, when you get a high producing animal, you know, she's making 90 to 100 pounds of milk a day, and most of that milk is going to be water. So you know that she's going to be taking in at least that much water. And it was interesting. I was in dairy practice, and one of the things that we would see, I was actually in practice in the Shenandoah Valley. We had a lot of smaller herds that their cows had access to streams. And one of the things that we saw was in the summertime, we had an increase in mastitis, we had an increase in somatic cell count because those cows were going in and standing in the streams. And essentially what that does, it softens up the teat sphincter and it allows bacteria to enter through the end of that teat, and it can cause a clinical case of mastitis that can make that cow very sick. And that can occur from gram-negative bacteria like E. coli, or you can just get a subclinical case where you don't necessarily see the cow sick, but what happens is her cell count starts rising and it costs you a lot of money and you don't even know that that's occurring. So there's a lot of risk to a dairy cow as far as standing in that water. And then you, of course, run the risk of some infectious disease on top of mastitis pathogens.
So with all that said about animal productivity, how is livestock exclusion good for your farm?
Well, we needed to do some fencing. Cub Run, when it gets angry, it comes out of the mountain with a lot of force. There's a large mountain behind us and it pushes stuff to us. So we needed to re-fence. We didn't want to go back with woven wire. We didn't want to be fixing fence 2 or 3 times a year because of the creek. So we talked with the NRCS about a plan that we could exclude the streams, lose as minimal of our pasture ground as we could, and still accomplish the fact that cattle were out of the water, and use our spring that we were going to develop and build that fence that we needed using high tensile electric.
I think it's a very nice dovetail between the stream exclusion and our pasture management systems, the rotational grazing or management intensive grazing. The two fit very nicely together. As we're developing those watering systems to get cattle out of the stream, it's also a perfect opportunity to develop or improve our existing pasture systems.
Public perception of a farm is also a concern.
I think a good many farmers realize that the way their farm looks to the public can affect public opinion. Farms that are well managed, meaning there's flowers in the flower bed next to the house, the lawns are mowed, the fences are kept in good order. People look at those farms, even if there's cattle in the stream or something, that they think that's a good managed farm. Whereas if a farmer doesn't keep the grass mowed, keep the weeds under control around the farmstead, their fences are falling down, even if the cattle are out of the stream on a farm like that, people going by think that, ooh, that's not a well-managed farm. The fences are falling down, the buildings are falling down.
Stream crossings are designed with specific benefits in mind.
We had talked about hardened crossings, perhaps, and I would call it a bridge. It's a culvert crossing. We're over a spring run that's never going to flood us, so we could handle the capacity of water. I didn't want to be dragging tractors and trucks over a dip that I might be dragging. So obviously a culvert crossing worked fine for here. It's built to be here. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. It handles the water. The water's probably never more than half a culvert full, even in a real event. So we've got 2 of these crossings. One is on Cub Run, which is a pretty healthy body of water, and it's designed that when there is overcapacity, that it's designed in such a manner that the water goes around, and it looks like it's flooding, which it is, but that's the design of it. The culverts can't take all the water. The terrain is laid out to where it fit perfectly and just circles it, and minimum washing, very minimal.
And then there are the buffer zones, made up of vegetation growing between the fence and the stream. This provides erosion control. It also keeps livestock away from the stream bank. Researchers have found that fencing cattle away from a stream cuts soil erosion by 40% and reduced the amount of sediment reaching the stream by 50%. And no, you don't have to lose a lot of acreage when you use a buffer zone around streams. We'll explain why in just a few moments. But first, let's go back to why livestock exclusion is good for the health of your animals. Potentially harmful organisms can be present in streams, including bacteria and viruses that cause foot rot, environmental mastitis, jaundice, fever, red nose, bovine virus diarrhea or BVD, and tuberculosis. Restricting livestock access to the stream and providing an alternative water source limits contact with these pathogens. This is particularly important with dairy cattle.
Reproduction is also a critical factor on a dairy farm. These cows have to have a calf, obviously, to make milk. So it's important, and our goal is for them to calve on an annual basis. And one of the last things we want to do is unnecessarily expose a cow to an infectious agent that can cause a problem with that reproduction. And some of the infectious agents that we consider when it comes to reproduction are diseases like IBR, BVD, and leptospirosis. And those are all diseases that if there's an infected animal that they could pick up from a water source. And things like BVD can affect the ability of those animals to get bred, and one of the things that we'll see is we'll have cows with a BVD infection that will have poor conception, and oftentimes we can also see with diseases like leptospirosis and IBR, we can see abortions. And those are animals that a farmer has spent a lot of time and money trying to get them bred, and then they lose that calf to an abortion. So another great reason why we want to make sure that we don't expose them to infectious agents through a contaminated water source.
Livestock exclusion can also lead to an improvement in the soundness of an animal's feet and legs.
The biggest difference is hoof health, because of wanting to stand in the water and congregate amongst themselves all the time. So hoof health and water quality is better. There's no question about it. Before we put the fence up, after we had installed the waters, cattle used the waters. They'd never seen a water. I mean, that wasn't their normal way of life, but it was fresh, moving water, and they would choose that over fresh stream water. And you read about it and you hear about it. It was eye-opening when you see cattle congregate around the water rather than go to where they were, 2 weeks earlier and getting their drink of water.
One of the things that dairy farmers recognize is that hoof care is extremely important to them, and it's important because those cattle have to be able to move around the farm, they have to be able to make it to the milk parlor, they have to be able to make it to the feed bunk, and it's critical that they have good feet and legs to do that on. So farmers spend a lot of time making sure that those hooves are trimmed properly and that they don't have infections such as hoof rot in the feet. And one of the things that we notice is when we take cattle out of stream beds and ponds, we reduce the amount of hoof rot that we see related to them standing in ponds and picking up infections in their feet. So that's one of the advantages, and these are well trimmed dairy cows. They have good feet and legs, and I don't see any obvious lameness in the feet on any of these cows. And these cows are actually all, for the most part, in confinement. They're in restricted areas, but they have some pasture access, and they don't have access to stand in waterways. So I think they've got a real advantage as far as their feet and legs are concerned.
Nordstrom talks about some of his personal experiences concerning cattle health and water quality.
Well, there's three of them that I can talk about that I think are pretty important. One was my first weekend on call as a veterinarian. It was in 1993, and there was a new strain of bovine virus diarrhea that came out of Canada. And that's a very mutable virus, and the strain was very highly infectious. And I saw on my first weekend on call as a veterinarian, I was called out to look at a farm in Sugar Creek, Ohio. And the farmer asked me to start looking at the cows, and I started doing physical exams, and I had temperatures of up to 110 degrees on those animals. And by Monday morning, this was on a Saturday, I had lost 50% of those animals. And what had happened was the farmer next door to him had purchased cattle out of Canada that had been infected with this strain. Now, the only contact between that farmer and the farm that was called me out to look at their cattle was a stream that ran through the barnyard from where the cattle were dying down to the barnyard where this fellow had lost half of his dairy herd. Another great example or story was when I practiced in Ohio. There was a farm that had bought cattle in, and there were a number of cases of blackleg. And blackleg is a clostridial disease which produces spores, and those spores can last up to 100 years. And after that incident had occurred, and this was actually before my time, they actually, you could not have cattle on that creek without having them vaccinated for blackleg, because once those spores got in that soil, there was always a risk that you were going to contaminate the cattle that were drinking the water. Now, the other example was, it's kind of a public health example, and this occurred in Wisconsin where there was a lot of runoff from dairy farms, and they actually were spreading Cryptosporidia into Green Bay. And what happened was those Cryptosporidia were blooming out in the water, and the city had changed its filtration system and started to suck Cryptosporidia into the water supply for people. And they had a number, I think probably about 4,000 people were sick from it. And they also had a number of deaths associated with it in people that were immunocompromised. So those are three examples of where infectious disease can play a huge role in contaminating livestock, and also potentially be zoonotic for people as well. So I think it's a pretty important factor.
Are some farmers still uncertain about livestock exclusion? Absolutely. And some of those concerns include
stream exclusion projects can be expensive, but fortunately at the present time there's adequate funding both privately through the state and through the federal government to help pay for these systems. And anywhere from half to over 100% cost share can be achieved in some cases for this. But it's what you make it. A misconception we have a lot of times is we require a 7-strand high tensile fence to keep a cattle out of streams, and that's an expensive fence to build, or a woven wire fence. And that is not a requirement. It's an option for the farmer if that's what they wish to do, but it's not necessarily the requirement. We have minimums that we expect to see, and that changes per situation and livestock type, but as simple as some programs allow as less as 2 strands of electric high tensile fence, and that could be installed for just around $1 a foot.
Well, and the most of mine came from private funding. There was some EQIP money that was involved, but the base of the project came from private funding. And the people that I've dealt with, we've had an open relationship, and it's always been good, and we've understood what we're trying to do. We would have lost about 17 out of the 80 acres here had we gone with some of the existing programs. And that was lost land, and then there was probably another 8 acres, 6 or 8 acres, that because of the way it was laid out, we'd have had corners and points that would have been foolish to fence. So, you know, we'd have lost almost a third, at least a quarter of our land with this setback. Another part of the reason we didn't like that was naturally there's a lot of trees along stream banks. We would have lost our natural shading, whether it be morning or evening. And you know, part of our management of the cattle is putting them in a place where they can get natural shade when it's hot, when it's cool, when it's windy in the winter, when they need protection. We can manage the paddocks along those lines because we did exclude them from the natural shade close to the creek.
That is probably the biggest thing that we hear from farmers. Is they're scared that by fencing the cattle out of the stream, we're going to take all their best and most productive land from them that's pasture. That sometimes can be the case, but the majority of the time it's not the case. Yeah, they are giving up some of the more productive land, but generally we take the opportunity when we exclude cattle from streams to develop a comprehensive plan for their pasture to where we can implement a rotational grazing system. And by the rotational grazing system will allow them to better utilize the pasture they have remaining by putting in cross fencing and water sources evenly distributed. The cattle are managed more intensively on that, and there's more efficient utilization of the pastures and better utilization, and therefore the production will increase. A commitment to keeping the cattle or other livestock out of the stream is a big concern, particularly when you're dealing with elderly people or land that's getting ready to be transferred to other generations of the family or being sold even in some cases. We have anywhere from a 5-year agreement with some of our programs up to a 20-year agreement, just depending on what the landowner is interested in. But it doesn't legally bind your land or anything like that. It's still the farmer's property, and they can basically do, in some cases, do with it what they wish, just so long as they don't have the livestock in the buffer area. There is a very common misconception that trees have to be planted whenever we deal with somebody fencing cattle out of the stream. That is not the case. That is strictly the landowner's choice. There are programs available, both private through the state and through the federal government, that can plant trees if the landowner wishes, but that is not the case. You know, the buffer can be grass. The buffer could become a garden. It can also become a hay field. It's just we're usually asking for the landowner to exclude the livestock from the stream.
There's a number of things to consider on whether or not to include trees in a riparian buffer or not. First off, it is voluntary. You know, at this point there is no mandatory stream exclusion program. There's only voluntary ones. Within that, there's a subset that are cost shared, which have some limitations on, you know, distances and whether trees should be included or not. But, you know, as a producer looks at all of his options out there, he has the option to include trees or not.
Fence along a stream can be a maintenance problem, but we like to work with the landowner in their specific situation to suggest the proper type of fence to install with their project. For instance, if you're building a fence along the South Fork of the Shenandoah, you're going to want to put up the minimum fence that's required to keep them out of the water, so that when it does flood, it's not a question of when or if, it's when it's going to flood. We want something that's going to be easy for the landowner and inexpensive for the landowner to put back, because in most cases it is the landowner's responsibility to put that fence back. So, you know, for instance, the minimum we require is a 2-strand high tensile fence, and we recommend that in a lot of cases along a river or an area that is flood prone. But if it's an upland area where flooding is not a problem, we'll recommend a little stronger of a fence.
One of the options available to some farmers is called flex fencing.
Flexible fencing is actually a program that was developed here in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia with the Shenandoah Resource Conservation and Development Council, with a grant from the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network. And the buffer you're looking at behind me was actually installed through the flexible fencing program. And that was a program designed to prove that you could install a buffer less than 35 feet and it worked. You know, I mean you'll still get stream quality improvement, water quality improvement, and it will also, you know, function as a buffer. And that was basically, we gave the farmer the flexibility to choose where they want to put the fence, anywhere from the top of the stream bank out as wide as 100 feet in some cases.
Farmer Bob Threewit sums up his experience with livestock exclusion.
listen to the options. Talk to the people who will help you administer it. And what I have found is that you'll come to a meeting of the minds that it's not such an obstacle that you need to jump over. There are ways to make it fit you. Your 80 acres, there's a way to make it fit. And you know, that's what happened for me. It's been nothing but satisfactory, and I think the common sense maybe is ruling over top of the boilerplate, this is how we do it idea.
Bottom line, it's your decision. Every farm is different. Every farmer is different. Management strategies can fluctuate greatly. That's why it's so important for every livestock producer to sit down and look at the options.
Well, when it comes to excluding livestock from streams, the farmer has a lot of options. I often tell people it's like we've got more options than Carter had liver pills. There's all kinds of private, state, and federal programs available. And what we like to do is work with the farmer to figure out what works best for their operation. Look and talk with the farmer, walk through the farm, or drive across their farm with them, sit down with them at their kitchen table, look at maps of the farm, and figure out what their long-term and short-term objectives are for that property. And then from that, we tailor to them a plan that may incorporate one program, it may incorporate 3 programs. But the bottom line is we try to come up with the best option that will work for their farm, and we'll try to get them something installed with the least amount of money out of their pocket. My advice to farmers that are sitting on the fence or not even considering it is to talk with your neighbors that have participated in the programs, talk to relatives that have participated, stop by and see us. And we're not here to tell you how to run your farm. We're here to give you ideas and suggestions on how to improve your farm, and ultimately that will give you ideas and suggestions that will help improve your bottom line.
Recapping some of the reasons to implement livestock exclusion management on your farm. These days, a farmer has to be efficient. If you can cut down on your vet bills, why wouldn't you? Improved forages and better soil quality. Healthier animals and healthier land lead to improved production and higher profit potential.
This is a beautiful meadow, and there's no question that it's got the capability of keeping a lot of cattle. And you know, the whole thing has worked out just like it's supposed to.